So today I'm going to introduce you to Rumi. So we're going to talk about the following things. Let me put the outline today. So number one, we'll talk about the medieval world. Number two, Rumi. Oops, Rumi, I meant. And then small a, Sufism, and small b, Rumi's conversion. That's it. Okay. So as you can see, we're traveling in time again and in space, right? So we're traveling in time from ancient Greece, which is around, we saw 300 BC. And now we're moving all the way to the 1300s, right? This is the Middle Ages in the context of the Muslim Empire. So we'll talk about that, of course. And we're moving in space. Since we're leaving now the Greek islands, we're going northeast all the way to Afghanistan, right? So that's where Rumi was born. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the time, right? Which is medieval times. And so I'm going to start with this question. When you hear about the Middle Ages, is it a positive or a negative connotation that comes to mind? Like, do you think it's a good time or a bad time in history? Let me hear some of you on that. What's the diagnostic? So you can also put it in the chat. Both good and bad, okay. Dali, tell us why both good and bad. You can talk. While she's trying to talk, anybody else? Where are you, Dali? I can't see you on my screen. Dali spoke, but is not visible on my screen. Ah, technical difficulties. Okay. All right, I will answer for Dali then. Okay, yes, she's right, right? There is some good element, bad elements, but in general, when we think of the Middle Ages, we think of them as the Dark Ages, right? This is like kind of a name we have given the Middle Ages, right? And there are several reasons for that, right? There's the Dark Ages. Anybody can tell me, why do we call the Middle Ages the Dark Ages? There's actually 3 reasons for that. Okay, number 1, the plague, right? There were a lot of plagues. There was not, healthcare was not developed, so you had a lot of deaths. What else is going on during the Middle Ages that makes it the Dark Ages? Was it a peaceful time? Were people, you know, like respecting each other's borders? No. Very good pistone, right? The Crusades, you had a lot of conquest, both from within the Muslim world and from within the Christian world, right? And then the last reason why it's the Dark Ages has to do with intellect, the intellect. Anybody know? Were people really knowledgeable during the Middle Ages? According to those who stand for the Dark Ages. Was there a lot of knowledge available during the Middle Ages?
Not really.
Yes, and that is actually depending on where you were in the Middle Ages, right? Geographically, actually. So we'll talk about that. So these Dark Ages actually really qualify nicely the Western Europe, right? When the Western Europe was in the Middle Ages, it was indeed like this. You had plagues, you had conquests, you had, you know, this kind of obscurantism. Let me write this term down, right? This is an important term. Obscurantism, meaning that the intellect or knowledge was not encouraged, right? The church really wanted to keep the knowledge in the hands of an elite, even the knowledge of the sacred text, of the sacred scriptures, right? This was not accessible. This became accessible much later with the Reformation, right? So, but during the Middle Ages, you really had, knowledge was really only in the hands of an elite. Now, this is true of the Christian Middle Ages, but what we often don't remember is that there was also a Muslim Middle Ages, the Middle Ages of the Golden Age of Islam. right? So this is where we are with Rumi. So let me talk a little bit about that because it's a very different picture, right? As the Christian Middle Ages, right, Northern Europe, Western Europe struggled with the plague, struggled with ignorance, struggled with religious persecution. You were having simultaneously in the south, around the Mediterranean, around the Persian Empire, around, so the Muslim Empire really spread all the way to Afghanistan, through North Africa to southern Spain, right? This was the breadth of the empire. Things were very different in that empire during the Middle Ages. Actually, you had the exact opposite going on, right? So if you saw the movie, The Physician, I think, I just saw it recently on Netflix. It's historically completely absurd, but it's a nice movie to give you a sense of the Muslim Middle Ages. I suggest The Physician, right? I think that's the name of the movie. Anybody saw it? Just curious. Put your hand in the screen if you saw it. Anybody? One person? Okay. It's called The Physician, right? Hakimian. That's the right name, right? Yeah. So suggest, please watch The Physician tonight if you want to get a sense of Rumi's times, right? So very different picture. Number one, the plague we said in Europe, but you had the plague also obviously in the golden age of Islam, but you also had a lot more ways of responding to it. Medicine was really growing. You had a lot of hospitals. You had a lot of doctors who were very, very knowledgeable in the sciences of the body and the health and so forth. So you had that, right? With regards to the obscurantism, right? We'll talk about that in a second, right? With regards to the religious persecutions. So the empire of Islam was indeed founded on conquest, but once you were there, right, there was relative peace within the borders, right? There was actual tolerance for people who were not Muslim. If you were Jewish, for example, you were allowed to kind of function in society, to rise to positions of power. For example, the great physician Maimonides, the Jewish doctor who was working in the Cairo kingdom during that time, was actually the doctor of the court, right? He was the physician of the court. So he had a very high position, even though he was Jewish. Often the advisors of the prince were Jewish, right? The merchants were Jewish. So you had, and of course, Christians were there too, more or less. You had a relative tolerance towards Christianity and Judaism within the Muslim empire, right? And finally, with regards to the obscurantism, with regards to this ignorance that was flooding Europe during the same time, you actually had the opposite phenomenon. And this is something that is often not told in our history books, right? The huge contribution that we owe the Arabs with regards to our own civilization, right? So actually, let me ask you, does anybody know the huge debt that we have, that we hold towards the Arabs with regards to the foundations of our civilizations? What did the Arabs do that constituted the foundation of our civilization, our science, our technology, our physics, our astronomy? What did the Arabs do that contributed to this? Anybody know? So they contributed, obviously, Pistone, right? They're developing mathematics, but on what basis, right? What is a foundation? So they had libraries, yes, but what books were in those libraries, right? Where did they get their ideas? What are they building on? Does anybody know?
Was it from the Bible?
Nope, the Bible doesn't have anything.
Because I one time I heard from one of my teachers from Ecuador that he told me that they were, like, one of them were following the Bible, and then he found out some of the answer, and then he was like punished for that because he was right, but then everybody said that he wasn't right, and because he had other kind of ideals, then he was killed.
So to a certain degree, right, the Bible does give some advice, medical advice. There are some texts on which give some medical advice in the Bible, not too many, right? And also there's laws of hygiene in the Bible. And this is an interesting parentheses I want to open up here. When the plague struck Europe, the Black Plague, right, it was noticed that the Jews were not getting as sick as the Europeans, right? And so the Europeans were suspecting that maybe the Jews created the plague since they were not getting killed from it. And actually we realized after, they realized after a while that one of the reasons the Jews were not dying so fast from the plague were the laws of hygiene, washing their hands, right? This was something that was performed several times a day as part of the religious ritual, right? The way they ate, the way they killed the animals, right? There were a lot of laws like this, right? So to a certain degree, right, the Bible has some good advice, but actually the Arabs were digging in a different source, right? And you're right, Bella, right? I see it in the chat. They actually, what we owe the Arabs is that they unearthed the forgotten and lost manuscripts of the Greeks, right? So the Greeks had for centuries developed medicine, metaphysics, physics, astronomy, biology, right? They had for centuries developed science, developed technology, but then their texts had fallen into oblivion, right? After the Roman Empire took over, the Romans took over, and then the barbarians took over, right? And in that, all of that bloodshed and violence, the Greek culture was forgotten. And so what we owe the Arabs is having rediscovered these texts, right? And not only did they rediscover these texts, but they translated them and they developed them. Okay, make sure you write this down, right? So the Arabs not only unearthed the forgotten and lost traditions of the Greeks, the lost texts of medicine, the lost texts of astronomy, of physics, right? They translated them into Arabic and they built upon them. And that's why the Muslim empire was so knowledgeable, right? They didn't just poof, become geniuses overnight, right? They were just good at unearthing these texts, studying them, developing them, and that's why we have from the Arabs, right, building on these texts, mathematics, astronomy, physics, and so forth, right? So really what we owe and then of course once these texts, these Greek texts, these founding documents of our civilization were translated into Arabic, it was the Jews who translated them into Latin. Remember, the Jews were merchants. They were going back and forth between the Christian Europe and the Muslim empire, right? And so they brought these texts little by little into Europe, and that's how Western Europe got the foundations of their civilization, right? So we really, and I want you to write this down because we are not acknowledging this in the history books, right? The enormous debt that we owe the Arabs for our own civilization. They're the ones who brought us these texts, right? They're the ones who uncovered, developed, translated, and brought us these texts, which are now at the foundation of our science, our physics, and so forth, right? So when we talk about what you will read in the history books, however, is that the Greek texts were, what did you learn in history that this kind of renewal, this rebirth of Greek civilization, where did it happen according to the history books? Anybody remember? We call this
Western Europe.
which country?
Europe.
Italy, yes, Hakimian, right. Right, we tend to say, oh, actually, no. The unearthing of the Greek text took place in Italy, and we call this the Renaissance, remember? What does Renaissance mean? It's a French word, anybody know? What does it mean? Nobody knows? Oh, thank you, Bella. Rebirth, right? Bella was in another class where I made the same lecture. Bella, stop talking. Okay, very good. Yes, Renaissance means rebirth, right? And so what you're taught in history is that the Renaissance, the rebirth of Greek culture, took place in Italy, right? And the Italians are the ones who brought Greek civilization to Europe, and then it spread, right? Actually, the Renaissance did not take place in Italy, nor did it take place in the 16th century. Rather, where am I telling you that the Renaissance, the real Renaissance, took place, which is the rebirth of Greek culture? Where did it take place and during what century? What have I been saying?
Islam in the 1300s.
Very good, right? The real Renaissance, I'm going to write it down. I've been writing to Tony so far. Okay, the real Renaissance I want you to write this down because this is important, did not take, like you're taught, did not take place in Italy in the 16th century, like we're taught in the history books, like as though the Italians were the origin, but actually it took place in places like Cordoba, this is Spain, Cairo, Egypt, Baghdad, in the 12th and 13th centuries, right? Almost done writing this. All right, there we go, right? Make sure you have this down. So this is, I wanted to correct this, right? This page that has been torn out of our history books, that actually the real Renaissance, the real rebirth of Greek culture, the foundation for our civilization was really discovered by the Arabs and brought to us, right? And then of course, Italy did its Renaissance and so forth, right? I'm not negating that Italy didn't do anything, right? But the ones who really started this were the Arabs, and they brought it to us, right? So that's what we often forget, right? The Middle Ages, yes, in the Christian world, it was the Dark Ages, but not in the Muslim world, right? In the Muslim world, it was the Golden Age, right? And there was such a difference between the two civilizations, right? That many people traveled, like in the story of the physician, right? You had Europeans going into the Muslim empire to learn to be physicians, theologians, philosophers. They would go and learn, right, with these great sages and then go back, right, and bring the knowledge back. So that's what was going on at the time. So it's a time actually of incredible, not only tolerance, right, but also incredible intellectual activity, right? We are really, during the golden age of Islam, it's a kind of awakening, right? Collective awakening to science, to philosophy, to medicine, theology. And this is the time that Rumi was born, right? He was born towards in the region of course, Afghanistan, but this was in that particular region close to Baghdad where everything was going on. Okay, so make sure you write this down, right? That the golden age of Islam is not at all, or medieval Islam is not at all like medieval Christianity, right? Make sure you show that there are actual opposites, right? While Christianity is kind of still, or the Christian North, right? Europe is still very ignorant, and they're struggling with a lot of persecution, intolerance. In Islam, in the golden age of Islam, you have the opposite. You have a lot of learning, you have a lot of tolerance, right? These are the two things, I think, which the Muslim empire has contributed to civilization, at the time at least, right? It was this openness to learning, number one, and number two, this ability to coexist with other religions, right? Now, this type of Islam, sadly, is not so, it's still there, but there's a lot more going on now, right? Which can surprise us to see that Islam originally as a religion was very open and able to coexist with its others, right? With the Jews and the Christians that surrounded it, right? So that was the two things. Now, this is important because you'll see with Rumi that his work, his writing, right, is also very open, right? He's a Muslim poet, but you will sense in his writing the influences of Christianity, the influences of Greek thought also, right? You can, if you know Plato, for example, which we do now, yes, you will be able to see many elements in his poetry resonate with Plato's philosophy, right? If you know Christianity, you will also see elements of that in his philosophy. So even Rumi, right, he is himself, like the Muslim empire, he's a crossroads of influences, right? And that's where you get, he's truly the son of his times, right? Just like Islam at the time was a crossroad of influences, Islam was very open. It was open to Greek thought. It was open to coexisting with others, right? Likewise, Rumi, as a poet, as a product of his times, is also himself a crossroads, right? Okay, let's go a little more now into Rumi's brand of Islam, right? So Rumi actually grew up a Muslim, but eventually he converted to a mystical branch of Islam called Sufism, right? So let me write this down. This is a mystical branch of Islam. So this is a sect, a Muslim sect, which became very important and still exists very powerfully today in many parts of the world, right? But it wasn't considered to be traditional Islam because there are some variations, but we're going to study it right now. We're going to compare it to traditional Islam, and you're going to see that a lot of what the Sufis believe is also there in Islam, but it's a question of emphasis. Traditional Islam emphasizes this and Sufism emphasizes that, but Sufism does not depart from the Quran. It does not depart from the sayings of the prophets. It's still grounding itself in these scriptures, but it's pointing out what they believe have been forgotten truths, right? These are truths which exist in the Quran but have been forgotten or lost, and they want to revive those, right? So they're still, in that sense, they're still very much enrooted in Islam, right? Even though they sound very different at times. So let's talk a little bit about that. I'm going to make a 4-point contrast between Islam and Sufism, or traditional Islam and Sufism. Make sure, and Sufism. So 4 different points we're going to look at where they differ. The first one has to do with the transcendence of God. Okay, so in traditional Islam, God is clearly transcendent. He is completely other. He is the creator. He is the judge of the universe. He's not your buddy, right? He's somebody to be reckoned with. He's not someone you can just waltz in and tell what to do, right? So he's really an imposing figure, right? And a distant figure. In fact, and this is a distance which, according to Islam, must be protected. We must respect the distance that the God that exists between God and us, right? We must respect God's transcendence. And one of the ways that they enforce this is by forbidding the making of images of God. Now, does anybody know what is the problem in making an image of God? Well, what's wrong with that? You have the same prohibition in Judaism, and both are if you do this, you can become killed. You can, right? So what is the problem? What is wrong with making an image of God? Anybody know? Okay, very good, Tamam, right? When you make an image, you are in a way reducing God to what you think God looks like. And that's the worst thing that you can ever do. Anytime you take God and you make him small and you kind of, squeeze him into your own representation, this is the worst thing you can do to God, right? And in a way, you are destroying God's transcendence. You're making God in your image instead of you being in the image of God. Now God is in your image, right? And then, of course, Hakimyan, there is the danger of worshiping the image, which is even worse. So not only just the making of the image is already problematic because you limit God and you make God in your image, but then we become tempted to worship the image, and now our gaze is misdirected. We're looking at the image instead of looking at God, right? So that's just to give you an idea, right? Islam really believed in a transcendent God, or believes, right, in a transcendent God. And it was necessary to protect this transcendence, right? Now, Sufism comes along and they are going to flip it. They're going to say, yes, God is transcendent. But, and I'm going to put this here for Sufism, they're going to emphasize the proximity of God. Right? So versus the transcendence of God, the Sufis will say, well, God, yes, he's far, but he's also very near. And there's several sayings in Sufism that are very beautiful, which talk about this. For example, they say, the throne of God, right, is not up in the heavens, but is in the heart of the believer, right? Let me write this down. It's a beautiful quote from the Sufi tradition, right? The throne of God is in the heart of the believer. Right? That's where you can find God. Don't look for him anywhere else. You don't need to go to temples. You don't need to go to altars. You don't need to go to pilgrimages, because God is always right here inside of you. What you need to do is learn to hear the divine voice within yourself. And for this, and we'll see this in a couple minutes, you don't need necessarily to study something outside. You don't need the scripture. You don't need anything but to become in tune with the voice within you, right? By the way, this is not foreign to Islam, because you have a saying in the Quran which says that God is closer to us than the vein that goes through our neck, right? Now, this is symbolic, and the Quran is very poetic, right? It's really a masterpiece of literature in addition to being a sacred text, right? And this idea, this metaphor, right, of the God being closer to us than the vein going through our neck, what does it mean, do you think? What are some of the meanings of this image, right? That God is closer to us than the vein which passes through our necks. There's a couple ways you can interpret that. Wake up, wake up. You're sluggish. Is it the heat? Yes,
Maybe it means,
go ahead.
maybe it means that I guess you would say that he's closer to us than you would think. That just like a nerve on our neck is closer, is like right on us. So I guess too.
Very good, very good. Hakimian, you raise your hand. Go ahead, and then I'll get Dali.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing.
Okay, very good. And Jasmine, right, that he's part of us, right? So just like we don't notice, by the way, that our blood is pulsing here, right? Often we don't notice how close God is to us, right? It's so close we don't notice. That's kind of what the Sufis are saying, right? You don't need to look outside. You don't need to find a scripture. You don't need to find a guru. You don't need to find an imam. You don't need to take a pilgrimage. All here. All you need to do is connect, attune yourself, look inward, right? Very good. So that's the idea, right? It's the way they flip it, but it's not really flipping, since this idea, as you saw, is found in the Quran itself, right? This idea that God is within, right? Close to us. Okay, very good. Now, second point of contention. So traditional Islam says that what makes a good Muslim is observance of the law, right? So there's an emphasis on the law in Islam. Also in Judaism, same idea, right? On the law, which is, you know, all the precepts that are given in the Quran, all the rules, regulations, commandments that God has given through the Quran. That's what makes you a good Muslim, is to follow those, right? Now, let's talk a little bit about those laws, because most of us don't even know what Islam believes, so we can do a little parentheses, Islam 101. Many people have summarized these laws into the 5 pillars of Islam, so let's look at that a little bit. What are they? Anybody know? 5 pillars of Islam? Where are our Muslim erudites? Okay, very good. One of them is the pilgrimage. Okay, very good. What else? I can't write pilgrimage. Okay. Praying, very good. Fasting, yes. Charity, and there's one more which nobody ever gets. I'll tell you, is the affirmation of the oneness of God, right? Okay, now we have all 5 of them. All right, let's talk briefly about them a little bit, right? So first, let's start with the pilgrimage, right? Once in a lifetime, every Muslim is commanded to take a pilgrimage to Mecca, which is a monument where is it? Saudi Arabia? I don't even know. I'm so sorry. Anybody know where Mecca is? Oh my God. Thank you, Sumaya. Saudi Arabia. Okay. Very good. So they have to go there, and you know, nowadays the way they do it, it's a little bit different from back in the days, right? Nowadays they take a plane and they're in like first class, and then they go to a 5-star hotel, and then, you know, there's a pool. But no, at the time it wasn't supposed to be a luxury vacation like it is now, right? At the time you would leave your house with nothing on your back, right? And you would just walk. You'd start off your journey with nothing. Now, this is insane, because the journey would take several months. So why do you think these people would do that? Why would they leave their homes without any provisions, just set out? And what's going on? What are they supposed to be? How are they going to survive? Very good, right, Dali, right? They would leave their homes with nothing on their back, because they knew that this was a journey where they would rely entirely on God's providence, right? So it was an act of faith. They would step out in faith, knowing, and this was really a beautiful way to reconnect, right, with God, right? Since they would be entirely dependent on God throughout their journey. This was a way to relearn that we are really entirely dependent on God, right? This was a way to drive that point home. So So that's the first thing, right? So the pilgrimage to Mecca, where you would really learn to rely on others, on the charity of others, you would learn to rely on God, a beautiful test of one's faith or purification of one's faith. Very good. The second law that we wrote has to do with praying. And it's interesting that in Islam, you don't pray just once a day or twice, you pray 5 times a day, very similar to Judaism. Anybody know why 5 times a day? Why so many times? Anybody know why it's not enough to just pray twice a day? Yes, Dali, go ahead.
I'm not sure why it's like the exact number, but I think it has to do with like discipline being a part of their religion, like you know, showing like I guess consistency and like just consistent practice and like respect to God.
Very good, right? When you pray 5 times a day, God becomes an integral part of your day. You can't avoid him. He's in every corner, right? You live out a couple hours, you know you're going to face God. Couple more hours, you know, so you live differently, right? Because your life in a way is immersed in prayer. You live differently because you know you're about to face the Creator, so you can't talk the way you want to talk to that person because you know in 30 minutes you have to pray, right? So it does inform the way, right? The whole life becomes suffused by the divine presence. It's a different way of life, right? Than most of us who, you know, go to church maybe, you know, once a year for Easter, right? And then the rest of our lives, or Sunday, right? Or, you know, in the case of Judaism on Saturday, the rest, and although Jews, they do also pray 5 times a day. It's the same idea, right? But a lot of us, right, we just go once a week and then the rest of our life is our life. And we're devils during the week and saints during the weekend, right? But this is a different attitude, right? In Islam, there's the saying that each time you pray, it's like dipping yourself in water and purifying yourself. So when you pray 5 times a day, it's as though you have dipped yourself in a river, in a cleansing river 5 times, right? So it's an act of purification so that you can continue to go about your day with a pure heart, not with a heart laden with resentment and bitterness from what happened this morning, right? So that's the idea. Very good. Charity, why? So this is interesting because in our civilization, charity is something that we do out of the kindness of our hearts. It's an extra. In Islam, it's a commandment. It's normal. Why is that? Why do you think giving a part of your wealth systematically as a command is a good thing? We would think like, well, no, what do you mean? I made that money. Why should I give it away, right? This is our mentality. It's like, I built this. Why should I give my hard-earned money to these fools, right? So we tend to feel like it's, you know, unnatural to give part of our money away. But in Islam, it's an absolutely normal thing. There is no question you need to do it. Why do you think it's so good? I see a couple hands. So who would like to talk? Go ahead, whoever raised their hand. Did someone raise their hands?
I actually did. I'd like to say that I kind of disagree with the earlier note that you said that, okay, the Muslims, they pray 5 times a day, while some of us would probably pray once a month and then we're devils for the rest of the time. But honestly, there are many people who I personally know who can pray like once a month and are more morally intact than a Muslim who prays 5 times a day. So I completely disagree with that part.
Yeah, you're right. Some people are, and if you come, for example, from the context of Hinduism, you know that there's different ways of being in contact with God, right? Praying is only one. There's another way through charity, another way through knowledge, another way, right? So I would agree with that there are many ways of connecting to God, and you don't have necessarily to take the path of prayer, right? But in Islam, there's the idea, and it's true, most of us, to be honest, we go through the day, we might start out good, right? Unlike these people who are naturally good, right? It's true, there are people who are naturally good. My mom is like that. She'll go through the whole day, nothing touches her. She stays, you know, smiling, right? The rest of us, however, right? We'll start out our day all good, and then after a few hours of dealing with, you know, impossible people, we're gonna start our internal climate is going to start to shift, right? So prayer is really, in a way, for those people who, I mean, everybody has to do it in Islam, but it does, in a way, it is one of the ways to stay connected. But I agree with you that there are other ways, right, to stay connected to the divine. Dali, go ahead. Dali?
Oh, I didn't have my hand up.
Oh, okay, lower your hand then, because it shows as though you have your hand up on my. Okay, going back now to the notion of charity, right? Why do you think it's a good thing? Why do you think there is wisdom, right, in this habit of giving a percentage of your earnings to the poor? So let's see how many of us Americans can come up with an answer. Okay, so Bella has one suggestion, right, for purification. So let's see, there's another one. Dali teaches us not to value too high. Okay, very good, right? Let me elaborate a little bit on that, right? If, you know, there's something with money that as you begin to accumulate it, you begin to become attached to it. And the act of taking a percentage every month actually has strong, powerful impact psychologically. It enables you to stay detached and not a slave to your earnings, right? In a way, it keeps you the master of your money versus the money being a master of you, right? The act of detaching a small amount, right, each time of your earnings really keeps you in a state of healthy detachment. So in that sense, right, this is very healthy proceeding. Purification, yes. So in Islam, there is the saying that your money is impure until you give it to someone, right? It's a proverb, right? Your money is impure until you give it to someone. So let's try to understand what this means, right? I will give you the analogy of water, right? Let's imagine a pond where the water stays there and doesn't flow anywhere. What does the pond look like? Is it healthy? Are there many fish, many colors? How is the pond?
It's stagnant.
Okay, very good, right? If the water is staying in one place without flowing, it becomes stagnant, right? It's the same with money, according to Islam, right? If you start to hoard, right? Anytime you start to hoard, there is a stagnation that starts to happen. And so what they suggest is that you get money and make sure the cycle continues. You get, you receive, you get, you give, you take, you give. And this keeps the money flowing and it keeps you pure from the stagnation that comes, or the psychological stagnation, spiritual stagnation that comes with hoarding material things, right? As soon as we become hoarders, we create stagnation, according to Islam, in our bodies, in our souls, in our hearts, right? And so it's good to keep the money flowing. You receive, you give. You don't give everything, right? But you make sure that there is a flow, that you're not just hoarding, that you are reinvesting or paying people or giving charity, right? The money is flowing. So that's another reason, right? Very healthy habit that exists in Islam, right? Which teaches us detachment, teaches us compassion, teaches us responsibility, and teaches us also, and helps us not become too stagnant, right, spiritually. Okay, last one, which is fasting. All right, why do we fast in Islam? Why is fasting important? What are some of the reasons that people fast in Islam? Okay, very good, Dali, right? When you fast, if any of you have tried it, right, when you're finally not eating all of the heavy foods you usually eat in the standard American diet, yes, you will notice some mental clarity, right? Very good. And it makes you more capable of connecting spiritually when you're not, with a big burger in your stomach. And Lopez mentions sacrifice. Yes, you learn to, can you elaborate a little bit, Lopez, on what you're saying, both the things you're saying, the sacrifice and the respect? Go ahead, talk to us.
Hello, Professor. How are you? Well, yeah, I consider that being sacrifice and respect because you're learning the true values of life and you appreciate things that you don't normally do. That's how I would interpret it.
Okay, very good, right? When you stop eating for a while, not only are you able to appreciate, right, the beauty of life more, you're also able to connect more also to the poor, right? Because you yourself now are suffering like them, right? One of the main reasons in Islam why you fast is to be able to know what the poor feel like every day when they go to bed, right? So it does make you more sensitive, more respectful. You are able also through the sacrifice to open up to a bigger dimension, which is a spiritual dimension, right? As you sacrifice your body to the fast, you also are able to gain more on the spiritual plane, right? This is very Platonic, by the way, right? Remember Plato when he said, you know, you need to leave behind the material to connect to the spiritual? Same idea. The fast, you leave behind the material so you can better connect to the spiritual. Okay, so, all right, so we have done our Islam 101. I think now you're more familiar with our Muslim neighbors. We're all from Queens, we should know each other. And yes, Maya, also to show gratitude. How is fasting a way to show gratitude? I'm curious. Would you like to elaborate? No? Being thankful for something. Okay, very good, right? You fast is a way to express gratitude, is a way to reconnect to the creator and so forth. Absolutely, right? Okay, very good. So now that we've done, okay, so that's the second point, right, of traditional Islam. First one was the transcendence of God. Now we have the importance of the law. Now again, the Sufis will overturn it, right? After we've done this long explanation, the Sufis will say, the law is not so important. What matters really is love, right? Matters. So what matters is not, oops, I'm writing to Lopez again. Okay, hold on. What matters is not so much the law, but the love in your heart, right? Checking this. Okay, very good, right? So in other words, according to the Sufis, the law is not, you shouldn't discard the law, right? They're not saying, you know, screw the law. They're saying the law will only take you so far. And in the end, what the purpose of the law is, of all of these rules, is really to make you a more loving person, right? So if you can achieve that then you're good. You don't need all of these observances and rituals, right? So they say the real important thing here is the condition of the heart, not the outward gestures, right? So, for example, they have a story in Sufism that says that the law will bring you all the way to the doors of the palace of the king, right? Anybody know what the palace and the king represent? And then I'll respond to you, can I? What does the palace represent and who is the king? The law brings you all the way to the doors of that king. So who's the king?
God.
Okay, very good, right? So absolutely, right? So the law will bring you all the way to the doors, but he says, if you don't have love in your heart, you can't cross through those doors, right? So in other words, that's the story, right? If you can go, the law will take you pretty far, but if it doesn't develop love in your heart, in the end, you won't even be able to access. You'll be like the pagan over there, way in the end of the line, right? You'll be worse, right? Because you've gone so far, but for nothing, right? So that's the idea. They say for them, ultimately what really matters, they say, is not so much the outward observances, but the inner condition of the heart, right? So similar to what Kanai was saying, right? Where some people are just naturally nice. They don't seem to need these ceremonies and these rituals, right? And that's what the Sufis are saying, is that if you can achieve love, you don't need it, the rest, because the rest is there to develop the love, right? Very good. Kanai, did you have a hand up or was it from before?
No, I have my hand up. I want to ask, like, why is there a pillar that says oneness with God, yet, like the Arabics, who are mostly a Muslim nation, their dietary are very rich in meat. So if we're taught that God is part of everything and everyone, then why do they kill so many animals?
So be careful, right? Be careful, because in Islam, God is not part of this world, right? It's not like Hinduism where God inhabits every living creature, right? In Islam, God is outside. So you can massacre. It's not going to affect God, right? When they say God in one, they're not meaning in the Hindu sense that God is in everything, right? On the contrary, they mean that God is only one God. There's nothing else that can be God. We can't be God. The animals can't be God. The trees can't be God. That's what they're saying, right? So because of this separation in Islam, where God is outside of the world, right? It's easier for them to slaughter the animals and not feel, and it's the same for Judaism, right? And Christianity. In as much as God is situated outside, you don't feel like you're destroying a part of God, right? Whereas in Hinduism, because God is in everything, there is more of a respect, right, for the environment. So that just confirms, right, in Islam, the fact that God is transcendent, then it becomes, it's not, killing an animal is not seen as a crime because God is outside of the world. Does that make sense, Kanai? And let me add, sorry, Kanai. The only being that has a part of God is the human being in Islam and in Judaism, right? So those you can't kill, right? So there is only us who are reflecting the divine, right, light or nobility. So it is therefore forbidden to kill a human being. But the animals are not considered as having a soul or having any part in the divine, right? So then it becomes okay. Does that help a little bit, Panay?
Yes, thank you. But I think on a humanistic level, that's very disgusting.
Well, at least I'm going to give this to the Jews and the Muslims. They do have a strong code against the suffering of animals, right? So in other words, even when you kill an animal to eat them, there's a way to kill them in both Islam and Judaism where you want to kill them as painlessly as, in fact, the animal feels technically no pain because it goes so fast, right? Whereas now, if you saw the way we do it in the West, I've seen a chicken going through the line of being killed. I mean, they take it apart. It's alive through the whole process, a whole half hour where they're dismembering it, right? So they do have in the Quran and in Judaism, a detailed text detailing that if you must eat an animal, you must not cause the animal pain or anguish. And if the animal is alive and is suffering, you have to help them. There's laws against taking the, I think there's something about the baby and the mother shouldn't be killed together. Like there's several, so there is at least an orientation towards animal rights. But obviously, since everybody, and to be honest, more advanced than the West. Obviously, in terms of animal rights, Hinduism is the most advanced, right? But then behind it is Islam and Judaism. And we in the West, with the way that we treat our animals and slaughter them, we are like the barbarians, right? So I'm going to give them that credit. Does that help, Kanai, a little bit?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, good. Okay, very good. Where were we? And let's leave the slaughter of animals. We were in the part 2. Okay, the love of your heart. Okay, good. So we've been through that. All right, good. For a third point. All right, this one is very interesting. This is one of my favorite points in traditional Islam, actually, and it's called the rational investigation of scripture. This, in my view, is one of the main contributions of Islam to theology. So let me explain. So around the golden age of Islam, and strictly really at that time it flourished, and then it went down, and I'll explain why. But you had the idea that we should not read the Quran literally, that the human reason had a role to play and when it's reading the text. So in other words, this ideal of total submission is not a Muslim notion, even though Muslim means to submit, right? There was the teaching around the time in the whole Muslim empire during the golden age of Islam. There was the teaching that if at any moment as you're reading the scripture, you see something that goes against your reason, that goes against your sense of humanity, you have the duty to interpret. In other words, we can't just read the Quran and read there, you shall exterminate the infidel and take a knife and go kill our neighbor. No, we should read critically, they said, right? You can't take all the words of the Quran literally, they actually say. This is amazing because we don't hear this in mosques anymore, right? This teaching, right? So this is really powerful teaching that says that we have a duty as human beings when the text of the scripture goes against our sense of humanity, when it goes against our common sense, we have a duty to interpret and arrange the text so that we don't end up killing each other, right? This process was called ijtihad. Let me write this down. Let me find everyone. Okay, ijtihad. This should remind you of another word in Arabic that is the only Arabic word you know, sadly. What does it? Jihad, very good. Same root, right? It means a struggle, right? Ijtihad means to struggle with the text. Ijtihad, let me write it down again, means the struggle with the text. In other words, you have a duty as a Muslim to struggle with the text. Now, to be fair, not everybody should be doing that. Only the learned, only people who have a strong background in Arabic and so forth, right? You have the authority to struggle with the text, not the stupid idiot next door, right? If he starts to struggle with the text, it's going to go very badly, right? So this was for scholars only, but nevertheless, the scholars had the duty to interpret, to struggle with the text, and to arrange things so that the text doesn't become lethal and dangerous and toxic, right? Same idea in Judaism with the oral tradition, right? It's not enough that written scripture. The rabbis then have a duty to interpret, soften the text, humanize the text. Some rabbis say even civilize the text, right? Otherwise, you end up, and to be fair, it's true. Any three scriptures, by the way, of the Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, you can have those scriptures and you can use them to kill others. There is plenty of passages in all three scriptures which can push you to genocide and brutality and violence, right? So this is a very powerful and important and relevant teaching, right, that the Muslim scholars at the time were teaching. We need to interpret. We can't just take literally, right? And this is the reason, by the way, why we have so many problems now in both, on all three religions. Each time you have a Christian bombing, right, an abortion center, for example, or you have a Jew in Israel bombing some settlers, right, some Palestinian village, or you have some, Muslims, right, becoming part of ISIS, right? This is all, and they have the scripture behind them, right? This is because they're not doing this discipline, right? They're taking the scripture and they're saying, thou shalt not kill. Therefore, let me kill you now before you kill anybody else. This is really the idea, right? So it can become, and they were aware, the scripture in the wrong hands, if it's not interpreted intelligently, can become a dangerous weapon. And they are right. And we see this throughout the three monotheisms. We see this in Christianity, in Islam, and Judaism, how people are taking the scripture at face value and using it to kill others, right? And so I love this teaching, right? This is for me one of the most important contributions of medieval Islam. Sadly, with the rise of, there are several things that happened which kind of diluted this practice. There's two main converging forces which caused Islam to lose this a little bit. The first one was the rise of fundamentalist Islam, which wanted a pure Islam, right? Whereas there's no contact with the outside and we are just following blindly the text, right? So there were some fundamentalist factions during the Golden Age, actually, which would periodically take over, right? And then there was the need to hold the people, the need to gain political power. And for that, you can't have a bunch of people being critical, right? It's well known, dictatorships have no room for intellectuals or critical mindset, right? So and you see this also in the movie, which I hope you'll watch tonight, The Physician, right? Where you have the fundamentalist faction allying itself with power in order to rule, right? And then you have the loss of this practice, right? So there was really the fight for power between the fundamentalist factions of Islam and the more enlightened factions, and ultimately this practice is still going on in some parts, and in other parts it's not. Islam is still very mixed what do you call it? A mixed company, we'll say, right? Very good. So, but this was really used to be mainstream, right? And now it's not as mainstream anymore, this practice. Okay, now, of course, the Sufis are going to overturn this, right? So for the Sufis, for number 3, they will say, we don't need reason. In fact, there are some elements of, we need to learn to become more irrational, to be more irrational when it comes to spirituality, right? In other words, they acknowledge that when it comes to knowing God and to doing the spiritual journey, there are moments where you have to leave your reason behind, right? In other words, you will not be able to understand everything, to foresee everything, to calculate everything. Sometimes you have to take a leap of faith. You have to keep walking even though you can't see. This is the essence of faith, right? So they admitted, the Sufis actually emphasized the fact that the spiritual journey entailed that you have to sometimes leave your head behind, right? Your head in a way is not well adapted to knowing God. Only the heart can lead you, right? So you have sometimes to follow your heart with your mind full of questions, right? And that's the idea. Okay, we'll stay with these 3 points. Let me talk briefly about Rumi in the 4 minutes that remain. So let me give you his dates, 1207 to 1273. By the way, I give you this long introduction to Sufism because it's the only way, with what I gave you now, you will be able to actually understand Rumi's poetry. Because what he's writing, of course he's writing on love, but he's more writing on the love between the human and God, right? And the way that he's writing is really a code for spiritual truths. So it sounds very beautiful, but it's more than beautiful. It's also a code. It's coded language for very profound spiritual truths. So a lot of what he's writing in his poetry is hiding a deeper spiritual message, right? So it helps to know a little bit of Sufism to be able to decipher the coded language of his poetry, right? Now you can know what the friend means or what water means, right? And you're able to read into the symbols, right? So you should be able now, with this introduction to Sufism, to better understand the poetry, right? Otherwise it'll just sound pretty, but you won't be able to capture the meaning. Okay. Where was I? Okay, Rumi, 1207 to 1273 in Balkh, which is present-day Afghanistan. So his father was actually a renowned scholar in traditional Islam, and so was Rumi. Rumi was raised like that. But when he was 24, they moved to Turkey, to Konya, Turkey. This is another very famous Sufi city, actually. Oh my God, I don't know how to spell Turkey, so I'm not going to do that. Konya in Turkey, guys, you're on your own for the spelling of Turkey. So they moved to Turkey, and there his father established a university, a Muslim university for Muslim studies or Islamic studies. And shortly after he died, right? So Rumi was he was supposed to be the successor. By that time, Rumi was 24 years old, and he was already well-versed in traditional Islam. He knew, thank you. Turkey, really? Aguirre? Okay, I was worried because it looked too much like the animal when I was writing it. Thank you. Okay, right. So Rumi was very well versed. He was a scholar, Muslim scholar, well versed in traditional Islam. Right? So he was not yet a Sufi. So he takes over. He begins to teach. And then there is a legend which tells us about his conversion to Sufism. So I'm going to tell you the legend, and then I will ask you to interpret it. So here's the legend. So legend begins like this. So Rumi is teaching to his students in his library, surrounded by books. And all of a sudden, there's a knock on the door. And so Rumi goes and opens the door, and there's a very tiny, frail old man. And the old man is just standing there. And Rumi is like, oh, hello, would you like to come in? You're very hospitable. That's the custom, right? So he invites the old man in and says, oh, why don't you join the students and have some tea, and you can enter the library. And the old man actually doesn't enter. He looks at all the books. And then he turns to Rumi and says, what is this? And Rumi looks at him like, what the hell? Why are you asking me this question? You don't know what this is, right? And all of a sudden, the old man goes like this. And he destroys all the books with fire. All the books disappear. And now it's Rumi's turn to ask the question, horrified. What is this? He says. And the old man says the same thing. You don't know? And that's the story. So anybody know the meaning of the story? What's going on? Who's the old man? What does the burning of the books mean? What is Rumi learning in the process? Can anybody give me the interpretation? Apart from Bella, who knows the story already. And Maya.
Maybe the person displaying the books was telling him to, like, that he doesn't need to look at something in order to learn it, and that he should follow what he feels in his heart and just what he thinks is right.
Exactly, right? The old man is the Sufi master that Rumi would eventually follow. And the way he burns the books is telling Rumi, you don't need this. You just need the passion of your own heart, right? The fire that burns the books represents the heart's passion. The old man is telling Rumi, what you really need is to just to follow the inclinations of your heart, follow the path that your heart is wanting you to go on, and that will bring you to God much faster than all of these books, right? So that's when, right, the story is really talking about Rumi's conversion to a completely different way, different path of spirituality, right? And so we'll see that in his, and of course now instead of writing big treatises of philosophy, he's writing poetry, right? Which is the language of the heart. So as now you're ready to enter the poetry, right? You can interpret it already. I think you're now equipped to decipher the metaphysical meanings of the poems. What we'll do in the class is interpret the poems together. So usually I just lecture, but this time we are going to work together. So start really preparing your own interpretation, start thinking about it, because I'm gonna ask you, what does this mean? What does that mean? And together we're going to try to decipher, right? What is the wisdom of love that we can get from this poetry, right? Of course, the poems are addressed to God, but we will interpret in general what is love and how to better love each other, right? Based on the poetry. So try to already begin to gather some of this wisdom, harvest some of this wisdom from the text, and then we'll be interpreting the text together when we meet on Monday. Okay, let me switch up. Well, let me talk. Do we need to still talk about the test? I feel like I've been talking about it for all the days of my life right now. Let me stop the recording and